Students, good morning. We are going to take a flash from the past and continue on and conclude a series that we were supposed to finish during that ice storm week in our childhood story series. And so, if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in the book of Judges. We're going to be in Judges 7. And as you're turning there, I want to share a quick story with you. My freshman college soccer season at the University of Mary Hardin Baylor, we were coming off a two-game skid where we really didn't perform our best as a team. And as a result, our coach, just like any time a coach gets frustrated with how his team plays, not playing up to the level that's expected, got angry, upset, frustrated, disappointed in how we played. And so the next practice that we had after that second game, we get a notification saying, hey, instead of being at the fields for practice this afternoon, you guys are going to be at the sand volleyball courts. And so the afternoon rolls around, and just elaborate on this story a little bit more, the weather outside on this particular day, let's just say it was a great physical correlation as to what we were about to experience as a team. It was cold, rainy, overcast, cloudy day outside, not the most ideal conditions in the world. And we go out, and I remember one of my teammates actually goes to grab the soccer ball bag out of my coach's truck. And my coach goes on to tell my teammate, hey, son, you're not going to be needing those days, so you might as well put them back in the truck. And so he gathers us together as a team, and he holds us up, and the very first words that come out of his mouth, he goes, gentlemen, some of you guys are either physically weak or mentally weak. So we're going to fix both of those today. And so now in the past, what we've usually done as a team, if we've done conditioning, right, it's usually lasted somewhere between like 20 to 30 minutes, maybe at most like 35 minutes. So we were kind of anticipating that. We knew it was going to be brutal, but we were like, okay, like it's just going to be about 30 minutes and we'll get through it as a team and we'll move on. Instead, what took place after that was we did a little over 2 hours worth of nonstop conditioning in the sand. And if you've ever ran on sand before, I'll just say this. There's a reason why Jesus said to build your house on rock and not on sand. And so we were running. If you've seen the movie Miracle before, there's a scene where all the hockey players are doing suicides on the ice. That's literally what we were doing in this cold, miserable, wet day outside. And just kind of my like personal experience with this, like I was on the verge of passing out. Like we were all huffing and puffing. There were spots of puke all over the sand because most of my teammates were throwing up all over the place. I mean, it was a brutal day, and I legit thought to myself, if this doesn't end in a few minutes, I think I might go be with Jesus today. Like, I mean, it was a brutal day to be a soccer player for the University of Mary Hardin Baylor. I'll explain the significance and why I shared that story with you towards the end of the message. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of wrapping up a series that we ended a few months ago. But we're going to be in the book of Judges. And just to kind of give you a little backstory on what's happening is the book of Judges captures this 400-year period of history where we see this repetitive cycle take place that takes place in 4 different stages. So the first stage is the nation of Israel rejects and turns away from God. Then the second stage is they experience oppression as a result of their rejection from a nation or a tribe for multiple years or a long period of time. And then the third stage, as a result of the oppression that they're experiencing, they cry out and beg God for help. And then the last part of this cycle is God sends and calls on a judge, hence the title of the book, Judges, to help rescue the Israelites out of their captivity. And we reach this spot in Judges chapter 6 where God calls on this judge named Gideon to help rescue the Israelites from a Midianite captivity. And so here's what you need to know about the judge Gideon. Later on in Judges chapter 6, when God calls Gideon to help rescue the Israelites out of Midianite captivity, Gideon is described as the youngest sibling in his family. And not only is he the youngest sibling in his family, but he's also the leader of the weakest clan in the tribe of Manasseh. And so when you're looking at this situation as a whole, when you're looking at this scenario, right, we might use that to say, I don't know if Gideon could pull this off, because here's what the situation entails. Gideon's army has a total of 32,000 men, which may seem like a significant number. However, here's the catch. The Midianite army that God calls him to go up against has a total of 135,000 men. And so Gideon's not only the youngest sibling, he's also the leader of the weakest clan or weakest army in his tribe. He's got very little assets to pull this off. But what I want us to take away from this morning, and what I hope to accomplish for y'all this morning, is I want us to take a look at God's perspective and dive in to his perspective and his lens on how he views this situation. So let's get going, starting in verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. I want y'all to capture and remember spring of Harod. I'll tie back to it here in a second. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill Moriah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, now this is, I'm going to pause right here. This is God speaking to Gideon, talking about his specific army full of 32,000 men that are about to go up against a 135,000 man army. God tells Gideon, hey, the people, the 32,000 that are with you, are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. So I want us to re-examine this situation. So again, Gideon, 32,000. Midianites, 135,000. God tells Gideon, hey, the 32,000 that you have are too many. When we think about that as a whole, we might think, like, God, that sounds a little crazy. Like, if you're Gideon in that situation, you're like, how is that possible? Like, I have very little assets and resources. I have the weakest clan and the weakest army in the entire tribe, right? But why would God want to lessen the number of people in Gideon's army when he's already got a significant disadvantage number-wise? It's because we can be in this place of dependency or even feel like we have too small of a number and God can still use us. However, the issue and problem that we can run into is not thinking that we're too small, but that we're too big and don't need God. Or we might run into a situation where we don't need God and think we know better than him. Because if we read the last section of verse 2, it says, lest Israel boast over me. We see the Lord's reasoning for why he wanted to lessen the number, saying, my own hand has saved me. Lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. So the Lord's concern in this process is that they're not going to depend on him, right? That they're not going to boast over him, that he's not going to get all the honor, all the credit, and all the glory, and all the praise. And so as a result, God puts not one, but two tests in front of Gideon's army. And we see the first test starting in verse 3, where it says, now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. And then we see the outcome and result of the first test God puts in front of Gideon's army when he says, then 22,000 of the people returned and 10,000 remained. So we see here that Gideon's army now goes from 32,000 people to now only 10,000 troops. As a result of God asking the question, who is fearful and trembling? A few moments ago, I asked you to remember the location of where Gideon's army is located, which is the spring of Harod. The Hebrew word for that phrase is En-Harod. Sorry, Aaron Parrish, I know that's not good Hebrew articulation there. But what that means in Hebrew is place of trembling. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because Gideon's army is in this place of trembling from the oppression that they're experiencing, from the Midianite army that they're about to go up against, to the actual physical location that they are in. Everything about this situation screams terrifying. It screams anxious thoughts and hesitancy. But what we're going to see, and the reason why I want to bring that up is because the reason why God wanted to test in this first test is he wanted to reveal who is going to let their external environments and their outside environment dictate their behavior and decisions. And I think there's this kind of common misconception in the Christian world today where God puts tests in front of us to trick us up or to trip us up. But think about it from an educational perspective, right? A teacher doesn't put a test in front of you hoping that you would fail, right? I haven't met one teacher that says, like, oh, I hope all my students fail, right? Like, they put the test in front of you not to trick you, but to see, are you actually learning what I am teaching you? Are you applying what I'm teaching in the classroom? And are you applying it to this test or this exam or whatever assignment that you have? And in the same way, right, God puts tests not only in front of Gideon's army, but for us today, so that we can not only depend on him, but that we can apply what he is teaching us. Faithfulness is not based on our external environments, but humbly depending on and trusting in God. Faithfulness is not based on external circumstances, but humbly depending on and trusting in God. Because here's the thing that this first test revealed is that some of the men in Gideon's army, those 22,000 that left home, or that left the army to go home, they wanted the title of being a troop, but they didn't want the responsibility. They made their decision based on convenience rather than faithfulness. They wanted a self-centered life. They wanted the laid-back lifestyle, right? They did what was easy and most convenient. And here's the thing about the self-centered life, is it may be the most convenient, but at the end of the day, it's the most miserable life because you're always going to be desiring more and you're never going to be fully satisfied. The self-centered life is the most miserable life. And we even see this played out here in the second test that God puts in front of Gideon's army, starting in verse 4. Then the Lord said to Gideon, the people, so now we're down to 10,000 troops here, the 10,000 are still too many. Pause right there, right? This situation already as a whole on the outside does not seem super good, does not look pretty, right? We're already down to, we went from 32,000, now we're down to 10,000, and God still communicates to Gideon and his army, hey, you still have too many people. Like, we're thinking, like, God, like, how much worse can this get, right? I still have little resources, I still have little assets, right? How could you dare say that we have too many? And so God puts this second test in front of Gideon's army, and essentially what the test entails is there's this fountain, again, going back to the fountain of trembling, right? There's this fountain that's around Gideon's army, and whoever goes around the fountain and kneels to drink out of it, God tells Gideon, hey, send them home. They're no longer a part of the army. And we see the outcome and result of the second test in verse 6, where it says, now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the people kneeled down to drink the water. So now, here's the current situation. We go from 32,000 down to 10,000 in the first test. And now the result after the second test is now we're down from 10,000 to 300 men. And here's the thing about the two tests that God puts in front of Gideon's army is they actually serve the same purpose, right? God wanted to see who was going to let their external environments dictate their actions, decisions, and behavior. However, the difference between the first test and the second test is that the second test revealed who is dishonest in the first one. In Navy SEAL training, there's a bell in the center of the compound where all the students and recruits can see it. And at any point, if a recruit wanted to drop out and give up, all they had to do was ring the bell. They didn't want to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, ring the bell. They didn't want to hop into the cold ocean and swim with the sharks, ring the bell. They didn't want to go through the difficult, physical, rigorous training, ring the bell. And it's interesting, based on research, the percentage of students and recruits that go into Navy SEAL training that drop out and that give up, that end up ringing the bell, is over 90%. Over 90% of Navy SEAL training students end up ringing the bell and giving up and going home. And I can make an assumption, this is, again, pure price opinion, that the majority of those students that ended up ringing the bell instantly regretted it because they missed out on the opportunity to be part of something that's much bigger than themselves. How does that apply in our lives today? What you can maybe correlate that to is maybe doing things because it's comfortable, maybe because everyone else is doing it. But I want us to look at the perspective of the 300. You know in the back of your head and in your heart that you're doing the right thing. You're waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning. You're hopping in the cold ocean. You're doing the hard physical training. And it's hard. Doing the right thing is hard. Following Christ is hard. There's going to be short-handed moments. There's moments of persecution. There's moments where you're enduring hardship. And in those moments, you're still doing the right thing, even though everyone else around you is doing the wrong thing. Everyone else around you is cussing like a sailor. Everyone else around you is watching that TV show or that movie that you're not allowed to watch or that you feel convicted about. Everyone else around you is listening to that artist that only plays explicit music. And I can't help but think that for some of y'all in this room that know you're doing the right thing when everyone else is doing the wrong thing, while you don't regret doing that, I can only imagine that it's hard. It's hard. There's maybe even a little temptation there, maybe to dive into the peer pressure. Maybe you may even feel a little tiny bit embarrassed, or maybe you even get made fun of or given a hard time for always doing the right thing. Here's my encouragement to you. If that is what you're feeling in your heart and in your mind, don't ring the bell. Don't give up. Don't grow weary, because what we're going to see, foreshadowing and spoiler alert here, for the 300 men in Gideon's army, they're about to experience something and even take part in something that's much bigger and greater than themselves. And they're going to see God pull off this marvelous victory. God's going to display a victory that seems impossible on the outside. But here's the thing about God. God uses what looks impossible and unorthodox to reveal his extraordinary power. God uses what looks impossible and unorthodox to reveal his extraordinary power. And he's going to do this using two unusual items in this story. And the first one that we're going to see is barley bread, starting in verse 13 when it says, "When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream." So this is a Midianite troop and another Midianite troop pretty much having a conversation here. And he said, "Behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent collapsed. And his friend replied, "This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has handed over to him Midian and all the camp." Now, historically, the reason why I say that barley bread's an unusual item here is historically, back in biblical times, barley bread was used for two specific purposes. You see, barley bread was used to feed livestock, such as donkeys and horses, but another reason that barley bread was used is it was food for the lowest social class. It was food for the poor. And so God is not only using Gideon's enemy, but also barley bread that was meant for the lowest social class and for livestock to affirm that he is going to be victorious. So we see the first unusual item that God uses is barley bread, but the second unusual item that I want to point out is jars. And we see that later on in verse 15 when it says, "When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed and worshiped. Then he returned to the camp of Israel and divided the 300 men into 3 units. And he put trumpets and empty pitchers or jars into hands of all of them, with torches inside the jars." Let's evaluate this situation here. So imagine you are one of the 300 men in Gideon's army, and your commander-in-chief, Gideon, gets up. He knows that victory is about to happen, but he goes and tells the troops, "Hey, we're about to go beat an army that's 135,000 men. Here are your 2 weapons, a trumpet and a jar." Not a sword, not a spear, not a shield. Like, come on, Gideon. Like, why are you giving us a trumpet and a jar? Now, a trumpet I could see for warlike purposes because it signals that, hey, we're coming. But for a jar, and when I say jar, like, don't think about it as like a coffee mug like type jar. Like, this is a big jar that you would like carry on your shoulders, right? But it's a clay jar, which means that it's super delicate. If it drops, it's breakable and easily breaks. Why a jar? Why a delicate clay jar? Let's find out in verse 19. "So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle night watch. When they had just posted the watch and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, they were in their hands. When the 3 units blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held the torches in their left hands and their trumpets in their right hands for blowing and shouted, 'A sword for the Lord and for Gideon.'" And so we see here that Gideon commands them, "Hey, blow the trumpets and smash the jars." And then we see the outcome and result of that starting in verse 21, where it says, "And each stood in his place and around the camp, and all the army ran, crying out as they fled. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the entire army." So we see here that Gideon's army blows the trumpets and smash the jars, and as a result, the Midianite army attacked, but not Gideon's army. They attacked and killed off one another. Nothing is too small for God, and nothing is too big for him to conquer. So why a delicate clay jar? Why would God use something that's easily breakable? It's to articulate that God can use a delicate clay jar. And just to bring this out even further, like, this is 300 men going up against 135,000 men. For every one man in Gideon's army, there's 450 Midianite soldiers. That would be like saying that, hey, for one man in Gideon's army, you get to go up against everyone that attended Paint War or Impact this past year. I'm not calling y'all Midianites, relax. God can use a delicate clay jar to defeat a 450-to-1 ratio. That might also maybe spark a question like, why Gideon? Like, why would God use Gideon in this story? Why did God call him to be the judge? Why did God call him to lead this army? Because God can use the youngest sibling and the weakest leader in the clan, or the weakest clan in the tribe, to defeat 135,000 men with only 300. God can use what is small, what seems weak, what looks fragile, what's lowly and delicate on the outside, to reveal his mighty and marvelous glory and power. That's the God that we serve. That's the God we boast about. And when we think of those moments, we just got wrapped up with March Madness, right? We often hear the term Cinderella story, right? We think of someone that's ranked or maybe a higher number seed defeating one of the top teams in the country, right? In those scenarios, we call those Cinderella stories. I would consider this a Cinderella story. An army of 300 men defeating a 135,000 troop army. When we think of those moments such as like defying the odds or overcoming fears or significant obstacles or challenges, defeating giants, one might say, right? However you want to frame it or word it. A word we might use to describe such an instance and moment would be called a miracle. And what I want to do is I want to tie this story of Gideon to the gospel. You see, in the New Testament, Jesus performed, I want to mention two miracles that he performed. In John chapter 6, we see Jesus get handed a lunchbox, essentially, with 2 fish and 5 loaves of barley bread. Going back to the first unusual item. And then a few chapters prior, in John chapter 2, Jesus performs his first miracle at a wedding in Cana. He turns water into wine. And the same container that he used to turn that water into wine would have been the same clay jars that would have been used to smash, that the Gideon's army smashed to defeat the Midianites. Here's why I want to point that out, and here's how the story of Gideon ties back to Jesus. You see, in verse 19 of Judges chapter 7, it says that the battle took place in the middle watch. Now, traditionally in the Old Testament, the middle watch would have taken place at midnight. And so at midnight, Gideon and his army smashed the jars and blew the trumpets, and God claimed victory over Israel's oppressor. Fast forward to the New Testament. We just did this a little while ago with communion, right? Jesus in the Last Supper, he and his disciples are having a meal together and doing this tradition called the Passover. And so this is the Thursday night before Jesus is led on to be crucified that next day. Traditionally, Passover would end at midnight. And so at midnight, when Passover ended, Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prayed and was later arrested, oppressed, and led on to his conviction to be crucified. In the same story as Gideon, where the Israelites smashed the jars to the ground so that their enemy would be defeated, Jesus' body would be broken and smashed, and his blood would spill so that the best miracle would take place, which is that he died and rose 3 days later, and our enemy and oppressor would be defeated. In the story of Gideon, we see 300 men defeat Israel's oppressor of 135,000 troops. In the New Testament, we see God send down one man, his son, to defeat our oppressor and conquer the sins of the whole world. There is nothing too small in your life for God, but if you're not careful, you can think you're too big and God is too small. So how do we avoid that being the case? How do we avoid God being too small in our lives? It's by humbly recognizing we are weak without God. It's by humbly recognizing we are weak without God. Remember in the beginning how I told you that I was going to tie back that nasty sand workout experience, and I was going to tie it back towards the end. Here's what happened after that brutal, exhausting day where I thought I was going to go be with Jesus. We went on to not lose another game in our regular season. We win our conference tournament, our conference champions, and we got to participate and play a couple games in the NCAA tournament. The reason I want to bring that up is because in life there's going to be nasty sand workouts. You're going to have to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. There's going to be moments where it feels like you are swimming in a cold ocean and sharks are surrounding you. There's going to be moments where you're going through physical, hard, enduring training. And in those moments, there's a bell that you can ring. You can let your emotions get the best of you. You can let convenience become your biggest factor. You can do what everyone else is doing. You can wave the white flag. You can do the easy thing. But here's the thing. We weren't made for the self-dependent and independent lifestyle. We were made for relational dependency on the extraordinarily powerful God of the universe. And just like Gideon and the 300 men, we don't let our external circumstances or our external environments dictate our faithfulness to him. We avoid God being too small in our lives by humbly recognizing we are weak without God, and his power is made perfect in our weakness. I want to wrap up our time before small groups articulating the words of Paul from 2 Corinthians 4:7, which says, "Now we have this treasure in clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us." He asks us to be faithfully obedient to him, so that similar to the 300 men that didn't ring the bell, we could participate in something that's much bigger than ourselves. We can treasure, take in, and stand firm, knowing that he is the salvation, he is the deliverance, and he is the victory in our lives. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this story of Gideon, a story that we may have heard growing up in Sunday school or Veggie Tales or whatever the case may be. God, thank you that we can unpack this. And God, I hope that this is something where they take away something that they've never learned about you before. And God, I pray as they go into small groups, Lord, that we'd be vulnerable, that we'd be real, that we'd be authentic. And God, may we honor and reflect you and remember everything that you have done for us. God, we love you, we praise you, and just thank you again for sending your Son to come defeat our oppressor and sin so that we can have life. God, we love you and we praise you. In your name I pray. Amen. God, dismiss the groups.